Hey everybody, it's a history buff. You can call me John. We're gonna do Oversimplified, World War II, Part 1. Let's get into it.
It's 1902. A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy to Switzerland to avoid military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist newspapers, advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang. This gets him in a bit of trouble with the Swiss police, so he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher, he finally returns to work as an avid socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested. Then
I always found it funny that he was anti-war and then changed his views. I will admit I don't know a whole lot about Benito Mussolini. I know that that's the basis of, essentially his ideas were the basis of fascism.
World War I came along, and once again he protested Italy's involvement. But then he thought, wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere. And suddenly he was pro-war. But his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples just like the days of the Roman Empire. I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness. That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you? Let's go with bold.
What a way to pause that. Okay, yes, Mussolini did want to, his real dream for Italy was to bring the Roman Empire back. That was, I think, first and foremost on his list, to have Italy become a great power, because they did not, he did not feel that they received their just share for their participation in World War I. But you'll see that in the future. I mean, you know, they invade North Africa, they invade Ethiopia. You know, they try to invade Greece. Is all these things are all former Roman areas.
Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it, but in the end, they only got a little, and they felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support. In 1922, he went to the king and said, make me prime minister, or I'll make me prime minister. And the king said, you and what army? This army. Fair enough. Then
Important to note, King, I think it was Emmanuel. I don't know. I hope I got that right. He could, if he was strong enough, but he wasn't that strong of a king at that point, really. He could ask Mussolini to leave, but that would be at the event of the monarchy. I mean, you know, if he did that against the will of the people, they would pretty much overthrow the monarchy. He was also a result of the inbreeding of the social families in Europe. And he was a short, thin, and I believe he had some disabilities. So he couldn't really project himself. But he could remove Mussolini if he wanted to, you know, really.
he went about establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got absolutely wrecked by the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men, couldn't have an air force, had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last one up, but it helps you understand how all of this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything, the German people loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party, and in 1923 attempted a march on Munich with his boys. And then he got arrested. But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president...
Interesting to note is that he was Austrian, number one. Um, he was he was popular within his party, but he wasn't necessarily popular to a lot of people. It ended up when he became chancellor in 1933. There was like it was like 33% of the population was with him. There was a real sort of, where are we going? Is it communism? Is it fascism? And he was a very astute politician, and he would not back down. When he wanted something, he wanted it, and it turned out that a lot of people had to make deals with him, and he slowly moved up, and slowly the fascists came into power. It's very interesting, and it's also important to note that before the Great Depression, Germany had their own depression as a result of World War One. The inflation went rampant. There were multiple, governments. There were multiple, I should say, multiple leaders, and some were better than others. But ultimately, the only one that people really trusted in Germany was President Hindenburg, and they thought, well, all right, we'll put Hitler in a high position and hope that nothing happens. But of course, you'll see what happens. So, point being, though, is when the Great Depression rolls around, Germany's able to weather the storm much quicker because they have just been wrecked through the roaring 20s. Everyone else seems to be doing well and prosperous for the most part. And then when the 1930s come and the other economies tank, Germany's economy tanks as well, but their recovery is much quicker.
Made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac, establishing a dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same ideas, but more importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit. Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, you're going to trade with us and you're going to like it. Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea, and they took a bunch of China's stuff. But then the West said, hey, cut that out. And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, okay, I guess we'll just go home. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. That seems unfair. We don't think so. Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there.
By the way, that was a huge surprise to the world that they beat Russia.
In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia, and then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up a Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies, and all want to militarize and take over more stuff. And so they did. Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation.
The Treaty of Versailles was one of the worst things that ever happened to Germany. Well, I shouldn't say that necessarily, but it was a very bad thing. It was meant to humiliate Germany, especially by the French, lesser so by the English. But Woodrow Wilson from the U.S., he did not really want to impose. He thought it was too harsh. He came up with the 14 points, and one of the results was the League of Nations, which was basically the United Nations. Except the United States didn't even enter it, but it was supposed to be a transparent group where diplomacy, a transparent group of nations, where diplomacy was transparent basically, and they could discuss things and not have try to avoid conflicts like what happened in World War One, because there was nobody before World War One to discuss anything that had gone on. It was a series of letters and entangling alliances and assumptions and reactions, and there was just no one place to go. It was a really great idea. It was a really radical idea, and of course it was the forerunner to the United Nations. Now the problem is that if you one, you could leave the League of Nations, and number two, the League of Nations did not have any power. It was just a place to have open diplomacy. So, that's about that. If you don't want to participate, you don't have to. And they are.
Of the treaty. The first Luftwaffe squadrons were set up, conscription was introduced, and he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up. The Allies did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2. He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum. Or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for
Lebensraum was a living space, I believe, and it shows a greater Germany. If you ever get a chance to look it up on Google, you can see the Hitler's map that he considered greater Germany, and what he thought of the people all around the German area, the Germanic area, and how far in the borders, what proportion of German are they. It's very interesting. Weird, but interesting.
now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this. Hitler would say, "I want that thing," and the Allies would say, "You can't have that thing." "Okay, you can have that thing, but no more." "I want that thing." And repeat. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria, and
Hitler didn't just do these things out of nowhere. Most of this was a direct result of Italy essentially invading Ethiopia and ousting Haile Selassie. And there was no repercussion for Italy. It was, the United Nations basically, they barely lifted a finger. And of course, a lot of talk of, unhappiness. And when Hitler saw that, he realized what an empty body of people this was, is that there was no military action behind it. People would not do anything. It also didn't help, again, that the Depression was going on, and there were questions about, like, is your currency based on the gold standard? And, how much does that affect your own economy? And you have Britain and France, doing different kinds of economic rebuilding based on that. And they're more concerned about their economy than they really are with Germany. And as things move on, they just kind of go, all right, they kind of kick the can down the road with Hitler. And again, after the Great Depression, Germany had already had its downfall. It did go through depression as well, but it recovered very quickly.
just took it, with no resistance. Boom, this is Germany now. Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, "Look, we're going to give you what... Hang on, this meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too? Anyway, we're going to give you what you want." "Really?" "Yeah." "Just like that?" "Yep." "What's the catch?" "Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia." "Okay." Then Chamberlain returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace. And we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia.
I don't know what's with oversimplified and statues, but it's hilarious. Yeah, Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler, and they basically signed an agreement saying that he was not going to take any more. Hitler said, "This is all I want," and that was that. It was very embarrassing for Neville Chamberlain and for Britain when he broke that the treaty. Yeah, there was not peace in their time.
What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh. You lied to me. What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action. He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears? Oh, there.
I hope I didn't say Treaty of Versailles when I was talking about Britain and Germany signing that sort of that Germany would not aggress any further. Sorry if I did.
There is? Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania.
That was
Then,
the first
in
one.
another incident which was maybe staged by the Japanese, gunfire was exchanged by Japanese and Chinese troops at the Marco Polo Bridge, and the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy made the
Earl S. Buck wrote a book about that called "The Rape of Nanking." It's a great historical novel to read. That will tell you everything you need to know, basically, about the Japanese soldier at that time.
relationship status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, "How about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future." Sounds good. This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September 1939, German troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giant...
It should be so. Just note that in the west of Poland, when Germany attacked, this lower part right down here in what was it, Czechoslovakia, they had defenses. They were preparing for a German attack. This was basically kind of an open secret that this was going to happen. It was just a matter of when and how. The Poles did feel very threatened. And then when Germany took the southern area down here, they were not prepared and they could not make defenses in time. And then, of course, once their army moves over, what was it, like 2 weeks later, I think, the Soviet Union attacked. It wasn't at the same time. It was Germany first, and then Soviet Union followed up. Important to note that.
crashing down on them from either side. Then came a period known as the Phony War, where everyone just sort of sat around not doing much.
You know what? It also note that France did have an incursion into Germany while Germany was invading Poland. They basically moved their army in like 9 kilometers or something like that, or even further, and they took some German towns and they met very little resistance, but they had no nerve. You know, their nerves were not quite there, so they moved back into France. A lot of people don't really mention that because that was, the Poles were thinking, okay, great, now we've got help. And then when that stopped, then all hope was given up.
The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day. Speaking of France, the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio, orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague, and the troops were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the Channel, and they wouldn't launch artillery strikes against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against.
And if you happen to look back at one of my first videos, which as they're going along, I think they're getting better. Let me know what you think in the comments. I did the invasion of France by Eastery. And I did discuss the shortcomings of France. They were not very mobile, and it took 2 or 3 days to, once something happened at the front line, took 2 or 3 days to have for the officers in charge to get the information, because it was, there was no wireless radio, there wasn't even great use of phones, and then the response was so slow that you'd have couriers going back and things like that, and it would take forever. So it was based on World War II standards, it was a very archaic way to have an army set up. And they were very much stuck in that World War I mentality of trenches, as opposed to Germany, which was lightning war, very quick strikes. Today we might call them, it's very, very fair to call them thunder runs, which you may have heard of.
In a war, They didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. They also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War, and so they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your armfields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark into Norway. The Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly embarrassing failure, Chamberlain resigned, and was replaced with Winston Churchill, who had a slightly different approach to dealing with the Germans.
Interestingly enough, Neville Chamberlain resigned the day the Germans attacked the Low Countries and France and the Allies in the West. So Churchill, at the moment that he took office, he was in serious crisis mode. And a lot of people weren't big fans of Churchill, except for Churchill.
Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the phony war, the Allies had given Hitler time to prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack. The Allies had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around France's defenses. The Allies charged into Belgium at full speed to meet the German invasion head-on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced, they sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended, because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed.
Yeah, this happened in like 10 days they reached the coast. This is because of French logistics, and each day that they got further and further and further out here, that's one more route that's cut off until all you have is an encirclement. So you're actually talking, while this is going on, supplies are already being cut to this group up here, to the English and the French that are up in Belgium and northern France. So by the time they actually complete the encirclement, which is a surprise, so if they're even able to get enough supplies up there, you're already talking shattered divisions. You're talking low ammunition. You're talking out of gas. You're talking anything that was mechanical is breaking down. You don't have anything you need after basically 10 days. You're on your own, and it was a defensive war, and they tried their best, even tried to break out, but not much happened.
Best of the Allied forces were now trapped. The Germans squeezed in from all sides, taking out France's best.
That's important to note, too. It was the best of the Allied forces. The British sent over 250,000. I thought it was 300,000 or more. But okay, 250,000. And all of their best artillery, tanks, mobile, and everything they had was basically there. And when Dunkirk comes around, all of that is given up. And then you're stuck with second-rate soldiers.
Armies and nearly wiping out the British too, but they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous journey to bring their young men home. With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans...
That was amazing, by the way. The dude, it's just stupid things in the German chain of command. During, also, the Panzer divisions being, exhausted and needing to refit after going across France. There are a lot of reasons that Dunkirk was able to happen. A lot of luck, um, a whole lot of luck and a lot of help, and they were able to save almost everybody. I think it was Admiral Ramsey, who was in charge of this, and Churchill started this withdraw very early on. I think as soon as even maybe as soon as the encirclement happened, or the day the encirclement happened. But he saw what was going on, and yeah, that was a problem. He even met with the French prime minister at the time, which was like what they were on, like what prime minister number 8 or so for this decade. There were no reserves. He asked, "Well, can you put in the French reserves?" There were no French reserves. There was nothing. Everyone who was trained was up on the line.
Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had.
Interesting to note, by the way, Italy did attack France. I don't know, June 10th or June 16th, something like that, and they attacked with a lot of divisions. It was like 6-1 or something like that, and the French had like 3 divisions on the border, and they held them off, which kind of shows you a little bit about the Italian troops and the planning. The Italian army was very much, who's the most favored general kind of thing. They do also have a very low industrialization. Their navy is the big thing. The army is just lackluster.
Done just like that. Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't, and he needed to secure the Western Front, so he tried to force them into submission with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it. Hitler then began...
Yeah, that's another thing. The French navy was still intact, and I believe it was out Alexandria, Egypt. No, where were they? Or was it Oran? Maybe it was Oran. The British made a real tough call after France surrendered, and the puppet state, the fascist puppet state, which, by the way, there were fascists in France. As a matter of fact, at the very end of the war, one of the last most tenacious units was the SS Charlemagne unit, which was French. They fought to the very end. But the British, or it was actually Churchill, decided that the British were going to strike. The British Navy was going to strike the French Navy, and they did. Just because it was just a wild card. Was it going to side with the Vichy France and the Germans, or was it going to be more Free French? And they couldn't take the chance, so they hit it. And it was one of the most controversial things, and it caused bad blood. But it was one of those tough calls. And by the way, the rest of the time, they figured out all sorts of different little tactics just to keep Germany basically busy. There was a lot of fighting in Africa, helping the French retake their areas. Of course, North Africa, that would become a thing. And the raids. I mean, it's not like they sat on their butts all alone. They hustled, as we would say today.
Laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside away from their parents to avoid danger. And
that is so important, and it plays itself out in history so many different times. Oh, one thing, I mean, it was militarily significant. If you want to invade Britain, if you want to win in the sky, you go after their factories. You go after the airplanes. You go after the factories that are making the airplanes. Britain, they would always, do a Hail Mary, and they did. They got to Berlin, and they bombed Berlin, and just Hitler himself, it just being himself, not thinking militarily, he decided, well, that's it, I'm going to bomb London and start the city bombing. And the decline of the RAF changed, and they began to rebuild themselves. Now, that was one of those things that's like a milestone. They decided never to invade Britain because the RAF, the Royal Air Force, was too strong. But you can see this so many times. You can see it even today as this is being recorded. The end of Bakhmut in the Ukraine right now. Russia is just plowing away at Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians are just holding on. It's at this point, it's just they're doing it for the sake of they're going to get the victory. That's why. And it's silly because Hitler did it in Stalingrad. Just because it's the name it was named after Stalin. So history is full of things that are not non-military people should never get involved in a war.
Frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence, but British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just the foot for now. Finally, the Luftwaffe sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands.
Yeah.
Hitler's invasion had to be postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Yep. All right, we're going to do part 2 next. Let me know what you think, in the comments down below. Please feel free to subscribe. I would appreciate it. It would be helpful to me, or share it out if you can. And you can get notified also if you ring the bell. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in part 2.